lecture series. I'm Bob Costrell, the Department of Education and Reform, and it's a particular personal and professional privilege to introduce our speaker today, Glenn Loury. You have his bio, one-page bio back there, which barely does credit to his record. I won't repeat all the honors that are on there. I would like to say a little bit about methodology, however. We've had a number of very accomplished economists speak to us in this series over the last few years, but I believe they've all been econometric in orientation. You've seen some regression results and so on and so forth. And Glenn is actually a fellow of the Econometric Society, but he's most well known within the profession for a different kind of economic methodology, which is more on the theory side. Glenn is one of the most accomplished mathematical economists of his generation, and it's a technique that is not well understood outside the profession. So let me just say a word or two about it. What it involves doing is trying to take a problem, try to abstract from what one views as the most important behavioral assumptions and interactions, and build a little model of a few equations. And the high point, the apotheosis of this kind of modeling, which Glenn is quite accomplished, is general equilibrium modeling, as opposed to partial equilibrium modeling. And what it does is it focuses on a number of key interactions that can lead to results that wouldn't otherwise be obvious under simply looking at one relationship at a time. And to master that kind of approach, it's a very austere, rigorous, and creative way of analyzing social problems to draw out this approach to a wide variety of areas. I actually first became aware of his work in the early 1980s for one of his first papers, a 1979 paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics on the economics of research and development, where you had a race going on amongst different firms to see who could be first to get the prize of a particular patent. And the question arises as to how efficient this operation is, and Glenn laid out the conditions under which you'd have too many or too few firms chasing after that prize. So that's a pretty good example of the kind of work that Glenn has done in so many different areas. Now, the other side of his professional profile, of which many of you may be more aware, is as a public intellectual, which is a phrase that is way too commonly used, but really does apply to Glenn. Glenn's a very broad thinker in a number of, he actually reads history and sociology and all this kind of stuff that most economists don't read, and which Glenn rightly chastises them for being too narrow. So you get this cross-fertilization between the issues of the day, deep issues of the day. Incarceration. Glenn has just done a huge amount of work on the issue of incarceration, which has previously been the province of sociologists. He's written stuff using this kind of modeling, even if it's not actually in equations, but in verbally on the issues of political correctness, for example, about 10 or 15 years ago. In any case, today we're very fortunate to have his analysis, simple analytics, and he's promised he will keep it simple, because we have a diverse audience here, on affirmative action. Thank you very much. Thanks, Bob, for your generous and protracted introduction.
You can have the extra time.
And thanks, Jay Green and company, for the invitation to inaugurate this year's series. I'm very happy to be here, very happy. Education reform department. We've been talking, ever since I got off the plane, I've been inundated with education reform discussion, and I don't know a whole lot about it. So I don't know if what I have to say will add much to the education reform ongoing dialogue, but It's a subject I've been working on off and on over the years, and I thought appropriate subject for sort of social policy, kind of multidisciplinary sort of environment. So that's what I want to talk about, affirmative action. I almost decided last night at dinner not to talk about affirmative action. And maybe I should start by telling you that. So here's my plan, okay? I got like 30, 40 minutes. And I'm going to sort of go over relatively lightly a set of conceptual issues in this area that I think are illuminated by economic analysis, and I'm going to tell you about some of the analysis that I've done in my own research. I'm not going to get down into the weeds with a lot of details, and I'm going to leave enough time at the end for you to, if you've been provoked, to ask questions and make comments and so on. We can have a little discussion. That's my plan. But I was just about to say, I almost changed my mind about talking about affirmative action, because I think my sense is that it's not any longer really a fundamental issue in the United States in terms of thinking about going forward, the problems of racial inequality and so forth. It's still a contentious issue. I mean, the Supreme Court will probably still be hearing cases. You know that Judge Sotomayor, when she was being vetted for the Supreme Court, was one of the issues was an opinion that she'd written on a New Haven firefighters affirmative action. So it will continue to come up. The culture wars are not over. I know you guys must know that. And affirmative action will be one of those fronts. And no, universities are not going to abandon affirmative action programs, and other institutions are not going to abandon the issue of diversity and representativeness of different groups is going to continue to come up. But in my judgment, as an empirical matter in terms of the magnitude of the effects, the relative importance of this within the mix of all the different policies that one has to worry about, education reform, for example, small potatoes. And moreover, my sense about the demographic dynamics in the country, what with the consequences of immigration and the sort of proliferation of minority groups and the implications of intermarriage that is going on at a very significant scale between Latino and Anglo, between Asian, quote unquote, and white, quote unquote. The America that we'll be looking at in 2020 and 2040 and 2050, they say a majority minority country, but I don't think that really even begins to get at, the issues of, Latino and African American political competition in different venues, the issue of Asian presence in the society, which again, with intermarriage across the generations is going to be a much larger number, and people are disproportionately overrepresented in key sectors and at a high level and so forth and so on. So I think affirmative action is kind of passé in the U.S. I think it's kind of yesterday's question in the U.S. I would not spend a lot of political capital fighting to retain, defend affirmative action. So I almost changed my mind and decided to talk about something else. But I thought that would just be too shocking to you people, so I'm going to stick with this. And one of the reasons I'm going to stick with this is because it's not just in the United States that affirmative action policies come up. I've been interested recently. I'm actually working with a political scientist at the University of East Anglia who's an expert on South Africa, and we're writing something for a journal for the United Nations, one of the United Nations things, on equality policy between ethnic groups in South Africa. Because, as you know, change from an apartheid regime and pent-up demand for inclusion in the society of black Africans in South Africa, very complex demographic context in South Africa with the Afrikaans-speaking and the English-speaking whites, quote-unquote, and Asians, quote-unquote, and coloreds, quote-unquote. South Africa is very interesting, and huge stakes, very high. It's a very black economic empowerment, private companies having to have blacks as business partners in order to be able to get government contracts, ratings where government agencies are rating the affirmative action bona fides of private entities, which influences their competitiveness because they can't bid for contracts unless they get a rating in a certain range and so forth, which induces a demand for hiring African Americans into jobs when there's a fair amount of kind of tokenism or sort of, you hire them in order to be able to get the rating, but they don't actually have any real power within the firm. And multi-hundred millionaire, billionaire types being created amongst Africans. I might have said African Americans. I was talking about South Africa. But you see, so the issue is rich with a lot of, in that context, it's a really very important issue. And also in other countries, I mentioned a few of them here, you know, the new economic policy in Malaysia with the Indian and Chinese and Malay ethnic diversity and issues of power and control. And of course in India where affirmative action or positive discrimination, reservation policies and so on. So it's a big issue all around. So what I say is, while I take the position that within the context of contemporary American social policy, I believe affirmative action is a second-tier concern and will increasingly become so, as a subject for study and an issue that you should be trying to analyze as an economist interested in social issues and inequality, affirmative action is a perfectly fine venue for analysis because it's a really important phenomenon in a lot of other contexts other than our own. I've written a fair number of papers on affirmative action over the years, so there. Roland Fryer, he's not here to defend himself. God love him. He's off paying some kids to learn somewhere, even as we speak. And I don't know if it works or not, and that's a subject for another discussion. You could have him out, and he can talk about that. I have views about it, of course, but I'll hold them to myself for now. But he and I have, he's a former student of mine, now full professor of economics at Harvard. You know, I'm kind of proud of that. He's doing okay. I don't agree with everything he says or does, but. So we've written some papers together, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of that research as well. Okay, so what is affirmative action? Okay, so there's a demographic group, let's say African Americans. There are high status positions that are scarce. These are the bare bones. I like that part of Bob's introduction where he says what applied economic theory is about, and kind of you build models. But you know, you start with an interesting question, right? You start with something that's an interesting question that people want to know the answer to. And you try to characterize the key elements of the question simply enough that you can formally represent them. Okay? So what I have here is kind of how I see the key elements that are raised in any context of an affirmative action program. Okay? You got demographic diversity. You got a minority group. For some reason or another, people are interested, socially disadvantaged group. People are interested in the extent to which the group is represented in some venues of achievement, of attainment. You have high status positions that are scarce, so there's rationing. Okay, so affirmative action is a rationing exercise. It's selecting. I mean, who's going to get into the university? Who's going to get the contract? Who's going to get the position? We have more applicants than we have slots. We got to decide. Without scarcity, there isn't any problem here. Okay. So you've got a demographic group that's disadvantaged, you've got scarce high status positions, and you've got a demand for representation. For some reason or another, policymakers want to increase the number of disadvantaged people in these high status positions. There are not enough African Americans in the undergraduate college at the University of Michigan. You know, the state legislature is passing on the university's budget. Some of those representatives from neighborhoods in Detroit think that our folks are paying taxes. How come we don't see our kids at the university? And so now the university's administration has to worry about responding to this political demand for representation, and they have then to implement some kind of policy. And then finally, you have these policies which by definition must be a departure from purely meritocratic selection. Okay? Could be a whole sidebar conversation here now about merit. Okay? Again, I would have to assume that at Educational Reform Central, merit is something that comes up from time to time, and people worry about what its definition is, how it might be measured, and what the implications of diversity of people with respect to their meritocratic criteria might be. Affirmative action involves departing from that. Now, that may just seem obvious and by definition true, but I think it's worth saying because you've got a school of thought out there that says, oh, no, we don't ever have to depart from any kind of meritocratic. We can have, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have affirmative action and nevertheless be upholding all the things. And I think that's not correct, and I think it's also not honest. I think the honest thing to say is that we have more than one value. We also value something else, and we're prepared to trade off or sacrifice one value for the other. We value meritocratic selection, and we value something else, namely representation of the disadvantaged group, and we're prepared to pay a cost. And unless we say that, we won't be in a position to know what costs we're paying, and then to make prudent, rational judgments about whether or not those costs are worth paying in a particular context. So I really think it's important to be honest about what we're doing with affirmative action, which does involve a departure from meritocratic selection on behalf of other worthy objectives. If it needs to be said, I think the objective of having people who come from Detroit represented at the University of Michigan, those who are capable of benefiting from being there. So I think that that's a worthy goal and legitimates departing from purely meritocratic selection at the University of Michigan. The Supreme Court agrees with me about that, by the way. But, you know, I think it's important to be honest about what we're talking about. Okay, so that's the typical scenario. Now, what are some of the questions of interest? I just remind you, my now 25-minute program is to lay out the sort of broad context and then to talk a little bit about some of the voluminous research that I've done on the subject. Okay, so what are some of the important questions? Well, early in my career, earlier, Bob says he read a paper of mine from 1979, and I cringed. I said, no, these people are never going to believe that I was writing papers in 1979. He laughed. But in 1993, I published a paper in American Economic Review with Stephen Coate, Will Affirmative Action Eliminate Negative Stereotypes? I still think that this is a really important, not just my paper, which has done well, but a really important question about how the inferences that observers draw with incomplete information about the quality of persons is affected by the existence of selection programs that are known to be non-meritocratic. You guys understand what I'm saying? In other words, you're a black kid and you got into Harvard Law, but everybody knows that they're letting black kids into Harvard Law with a different standard than they're letting other people into Harvard Law. How can I then fault an otherwise uninformed observer from taking race into account when he sees the graduates of Harvard Law School and needs to know something about the quality of the people that he's dealing with? Now, presumably you take other information, or she, into account as well, but aren't they, as a statistician, as a sort of optimal inferential mechanism, entitled to use all the information that's available to them, including what they know about the criteria that have been used to select people into the environment? Of course they are. It seems to me, of course they are. Again, what I say about that is that's a feature of a program that if we were to analyze honestly, we would want to take on board. And then the question would be, therefore, what are the implications of that? Okay? And so we study, and what we do, and just as Bob said so well in his introduction, we identify in that paper conditions under which affirmative action would or would not be expected to exacerbate negative stereotypes that might be held about, reinforce negative stereotypes that might be held about a group. And that's, let me just leave it at that. That's something I actually want to come back to. But that's one of the kind of questions that arises that I've analyzed in some research. What about incentives? When does affirmative action undercut the incentives to acquire skills? Okay. You go back and you read through all the debates about affirmative action. This is one of the key battlegrounds, right? Some people will say, well, if we advance opportunities for disadvantaged people, we give them something to shoot for, which should enhance their incentives to work hard to try to achieve whatever they need to in order to be able to succeed in life, because now they have a chance. Previously, you had no chance of getting into Harvard Law. There wasn't even any point in trying. There weren't any black people going there. Now, you see that some are going. You have some say that. Others will observe that if I increase your probability of success, even with a relatively mediocre performance, I undercut your incentives to perform, right? If I know that without an A average and a 95th percentile performance on the law school aptitude test, I have no chance of being admitted to Harvard Law School, I might work very hard to try to get the criteria that I need to get in. If I know that I can get in with a B and an 80th percentile test score report, I have less of an incentive to achieve. So people can argue on both sides of that issue, and one needs to write down a model in order to be able to take that into account. And this is something that I've done in previous research. And here, this final question, which is the one that I want to kind of focus on for the purposes of this talk when I get around to the model, which I'll treat briefly. Early versus late. Okay, and this is actually Roland Fryer's question. I think I have to give Roland credit. Roland comes in and he says, Professor Loury, because that's what he used to call me. Now he calls me Glenn because he's a big shot. Professor Loury, I've been trying to figure out, you could do affirmative action like right at the beginning, okay, and then you could just do away with it. Okay, so you could say like, we want there to be more PhDs, but we're not going to have a different standard for admission to the PhD program. What we're going to do is we're going to have an intensive thing at the undergraduate level where we're going to have for minority students, you know, summer camp, you know, and big shots like you, Professor Loury, come in and give them lectures, and, and you know, and ultra investment, you know, math camp and things like that, and then cut them loose and let the chips fall where they may, right? You invested early on in a preferential way to try to prepare people for a competition, but you did not put a thumb on the scale at the point of the competition itself. And, says Fryer, that's a different thing, isn't it, Professor Loury, from affirmative action at the end of the process where you got a bunch of competitors and somebody is at the top of the list and somebody's number 10 and you move number 10 ahead of number 3 because they're a minority and you want to have more minorities. Why don't we write down a model where we could try to study whether or not the optimal program would be early or late or what combination of the two or what? Okay, says Fryer. So we did. And I'll tell you about it a little bit. Not going into the details, but tell you about the general structure of our conceptual framework, our little laboratory, our model, and then about the results that we get. I can just tell you this. What we find is that under some conditions, I'll say the conditions, if you wanted to raise at the end point the number of African Americans, let's say, who are successfully selected for some scarce, prestigious, high status positions, the least costly distortion of meritocratic selection that gets you to a given representation goal involves entirely backloaded preference that is rationally anticipated by the investing agents and no early intervention. In other words, under certain conditions, the optimal affirmative action program is entirely backloaded. That seems counterintuitive to a lot of people because most people think, well, no. It must be better to invest in the human capital than it is to distort the allocation at the end by giving positions to people who are not the most qualified. But what we show in our model, and you need a model to see this in my view, is that if people fully anticipate the ex post preference, that already acts as an implicit ex ante subsidy, and moreover, it's exactly the right magnitude of ex ante subsidy, but it requires them to rationally and fully anticipate what the end stage affirmative action program is going to be. So anyway, that may not be fully comprehensible to you now, but I whet your appetite by telling you that that's a question, and then that's the answer that we're able to give through the simple model that we developed that I'll tell you a little bit about. More questions could be asked. Can you do affirmative action without doing racial discrimination? And the answer is yes. Okay. The Texas 10% program is a classic example of that. The state of Texas, after the 5th district court, is that what district that Austin is in, and they were enjoined against the practice of conventional racially preferential affirmative action, and the state legislature responded to that court's ruling by requiring that the university admit anyone finishing in the top 10% of their graduating high school class in the state of Texas to one of the flagship, Texas A&M or UT Austin. This was the way the legislature responded to having been told they couldn't do affirmative action. And what I want to observe is they were doing affirmative action when they responded that way. They were just doing colorblind affirmative action. Namely, they were altering the selection criteria with an eye toward increasing the representation of the disadvantaged population, but constraining themselves to do so through instruments which themselves could be implemented without knowing the racial identity of any person. But they're exploiting what they know about the background correlation, in this case, between college rank and race. Because if the schools are segregated to some degree, some of the schools which have heavily black or Latino populations will necessarily have a lot of blacks or Latinos in the top 10%. And therefore, if I say top 10%, I'm sure to get more hits on the group that I'm trying to get than if I say SAT score, right? Because if I say SAT score, given the distribution of SAT scores by racial group in the population, I'm not going to get very many blacks and Latinos. But if I say top 10% of your high school. So what, in effect, the state of Texas did, and this is about the question, can you do affirmative action without racial discrimination, was to alter the relative weight in their implicit selection formula that you put on different characteristics of the students with an eye toward heavier weighting to those characteristics which are more equally distributed between the racial population groups. Now, when they did that, they departed from the, quote, optimal weighting of the criteria, right? But they did so with the representation goal. But that's a relatively inefficient way of achieving the representation goal, because you've just changed your criteria of selection for 100% of the students when you're really only trying to achieve like 7 or 8% of the minority group in your school, right? You just admitted a whole lot of white people to the university who were in the top 10% of their fairly mediocre high school classes, who you never would have admitted before. Probably more whites being admitted who wouldn't have been admitted before under the blind policy than there are blacks and Latinos who are actually admitted under the blind policy, just based on the relative numbers. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm just saying it's entirely possible that that could be so. Anyway, yes, you can do affirmative action without racial discrimination. And Loury, Fryer, and a former graduate student of mine named Toga Uret have a paper in the Journal of Law, Economics and Organization that does a kind of empirical exercise that tries to measure how more inefficient is colorblind affirmative action than would be color-sided, racially discriminatory, explicit, above the board, different standards for the different groups of affirmative action. We come up with some numbers on that. If there's time, I might talk about that too. I'm going to skip past the issues of principle because we don't have enough time. So the young Fryer, again, and this is a paper of ours from the Journal of Economic Perspectives 5 years ago. It's still eminently readable, where we try to lay out what we think some of the myths are, and I'm going to talk about this. So you see what I'm doing. What I'm doing is I'm taking you through the terrain, and I'm pointing out what I think are some conceptually, interesting type questions. What I'm not doing is marching you through a model, because 30 minutes or 40 minutes doesn't really admit of that, and there's no whiteboard in here for me to scribble my equations or whatever. But I encourage anybody who has the interest. All this stuff is on my website easily. You can get these papers and you can look. Okay, so I want now, having introduced the general question of affirmative action, talk some about the questions that one might try to get at in economic research on this issue, to speak a little bit about the public discussion and the gap between the public debate on the one hand and and what we scientists know on the other. And let me see. I'm going to take maybe another 15 minutes, 20 minutes, if that's okay. Okay. Myth number one, myths about affirmative action. So we were being clever, affirmative action and its mythology. Here's 7 things about affirmative action that everybody thinks they know that aren't true. You can have goals and timetables without quotas. We say bunk, and we think there's a general point here. We say bunk because what's a goal or a quota? A goal, goals versus quotas, right? So people say we got a goal, but we don't have a quota, right? So people say quotas are bad. We have some quotes from President Bush and President Clinton, George W. Bush and William Jefferson Clinton, both saying pretty much the same thing. They're for affirmative action if it means goals, but they're not for it if it means quotas. I just think that's gibberish. I just think that's bunk. Okay? The only difference between a goal and a quota is the probability and severity of the penalty that's going to be applied in the event that you don't meet the target. Okay? A goal is a target with soft penalties, and a quota is a target with very severe penalties. Okay? That's the only difference. Everything, therefore, depends upon what these sort of implicit threats are. You're not going to get the contract, we're going to cut off your money, we're going to, whatever, that are behind the announcement of the goal or the quota. It's a matter of degree. These are different of degree, not of kind. It's just rhetoric to say I'm for affirmative action if you mean goals, but not if you mean quotas. Everybody's against quotas and everybody's for goals, and that's just avoiding the issue. The issue is, what are you willing to pay in order to achieve a given change in the representation of the underrepresented group? And how would you enforce any criterion that you might bring to bear on people? Okay? With no enforcement, oh, by the way, the WTO knows this very well. I'm talking about World Trade Organization, where they talk about tariffs and whatever, and you're trying to talk about the Japanese or the Chinese or whomever, the Koreans or whomever, for opening their markets. Measurable criteria with meaningful consequences. Right? Not just announcing that we have a goal that American imports to China of this or that will increase by 5. Measurable targets with meaningful consequences for not meeting them. Anyway, myth number one, I'm going to move quickly through these myths. colorblind policies are an efficient substitute for color cited. No, they're not. If you say we can do affirmative action without doing racial discrimination, I'll say I agree. But I want you to know that it's going to cost you. Okay? It's going to change your institution. Okay? Think of